Now we're going to have the panel discussion. My name is James Buck. I'm a technical delivery lead at Zenzic, and I'll be chairing this panel of experts that we put together for you. Just to go over who we have here, we have from your left to right, yeah, that's right, Matthew Avery, Chief Research Strategy Officer at Thatcham Research, Euro NCAP board member and leads cooperation with insurers, OEMs and legislators looking at safer designs and more cost-effective vehicle repair. We have Camilla Fowler, Head of Automated Transport at TRL. She's focused on ensuring the safe deployment and testing of automated vehicles and has a lot of experience in risk assessment and risk management. We've got Richard Hillman, who, as we know, Principal Engineer at HORIBA MIRA, who is also the author of the Zenzic safety case. And we have Bhavin, Makwana, CAM Insight Strategist at Zenzic. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to ask a couple of starter questions to get the conversation going. And then following that, we would like to get some audience participation. So when we get to that stage, Millie, who... Let's put a hand up over there. She will run to you. Please put your hand up. She will run to you with the microphone and please pose your question, but please keep it as concise as you can. So just to go into the first starter question, just a bit of pre-context. So simulation and digital testing is a hot topic, and a lot of this conference is dedicated to that. And as we know, vehicle manufacturers do simulation testing today, but this is almost exclusively to reduce development costs. So things like finding problems early in the product's life cycle, which means that you don't have to wait until you've built your physical prototype to discover all of the issues that you may have had. Final safety sign-off almost always includes some degree of physical testing. So as Tom was talking about, perhaps you're smashing a vehicle into a wall to demonstrate crash testing, or you've got a video of a vehicle doing autonomous emergency braking when you're proving your ADAS systems. And these are things that consumers can easily understand and comprehend. So the question for the panel to begin with is, as the role of digital testing makes the transition from assisting development to final safety sign-off, how do we gain the trust of consumers that a vehicle that's been tested in this way will be safe for them to buy? Matthew.
Thank you. Well, I suppose today I'm wearing two hats. So I've got the role of Euro NCAP, and obviously Euro NCAP's been instrumental in improving vehicle safety on European roads over the past 25 years. And that's really important in terms of giving the consumer the choice, but the information that there are safer choices out there, and it enables them to buy, a safer car, and they can choose that. We get questions all the time around automation, and we began testing assisted driving systems about 3 years ago now. And the framework that we built for that is very similar to the framework that Tom showed you. So it's very much a modular framework. And we understood there was a need there to tell the consumer about these systems. When it comes to ADAS, we've got about 56 different names for AEB systems. There are about 33 names for assisted driving systems, things like autopilot, pilot assist, etc., etc. So there is a huge amount of confusion already from the consumer understanding this. So we recognise that there's a role for Euro NCAP not only to tell the consumer this one's better than that one, but also to tell the consumer this is how to use them, and this is what this are the system limitations and your obligations. So, for instance, we've got level 3 systems, becoming onto the European market, certainly in Germany this year. And there's a requirement for the driver to take back control. Well, consumers don't understand that with automation. Consumers think automated car drives itself. All I want to do is use my cell phone or go to sleep. They can't do that. So it's very, very important that the systems are designed to do that. Now, a consumer rating system complements regulation. It doesn't replace it, but it complements regulation, but it also translates it for the consumer. The other hat, I suppose, I'm wearing is the insurer hat. Thatcham Research is obviously funded by the insurance industry. And there's also need there for confidence from the insurer's perspective to understand the risk. We all want to see mass adoption of automation. We've been talking about that this morning. But obviously, insurance plays an important part of that. And at the end of the day, so do insurance premiums. And insurers can only price things correctly when they understand the risks. So we also perform a very, very important role of identifying the risk and the risk between different solutions out there. And that is very, very important, because ultimately what we don't want is consumers to be turned off automation. There is a real risk that automation, and we've seen this in consumer media about people jumping on every single Tesla crash there is, and certainly there's a lot of interest from that from the general media, and we have to make sure that consumers trust these systems, because if it turns into something like GM crops, we can all go home. This is all a waste of time, because consumers will say, I'm not touching that, they're not safe. So it's very, very important that we bring the consumer along the way. They trust it, it's affordable, and they know its limitations.
Thank you, Matthew. Any other panelists like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Bringing the consumer along the journey is really, really important. You know, what you don't understand, you often fear. And I think by providing people with information, either like through trials and testing and saying, okay, well, here's our publicly available safety case. This is how we're testing at the moment. This is how we're advancing technology. This is how we're advancing trials and testing. So actually, you're going through the process with them. I think if you go from sort of NCAP crash testing straight through to simulation, without that journey, you could end up with a bit more of a problem than if, you sort of take them along the journey with you. But it's about reaching consumers across the UK as well. I know CCAV are focused on levelling up, but there are pockets of the UK that have had significantly more exposure than other areas. And I think that sort of uniform exposure of automation is also important in that sort of education piece.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think we've seen various trials where members of the public have been involved, and there's been a sort of tangible process where people have become more comfortable with that automation. And you've got particular areas of the country. So, for example, within Milton Keynes, there have been multiple trials that have taken place. So people within that area are used to seeing autonomous vehicles operating around the sort of train station, bus station locality. They've got the autonomous delivery pods as well. And you get that familiarity then, but we've also got to be mindful that it only takes one slip to undo all that good work that we've done. So we can spend a long time building up that reputation, but just that one incident like the Elaine Herzberg crash in America, that one incident can obviously set back the industry a long way. So we've got to make sure we're doing that in a safe way, that people can retain that trust and continue to build it up without anything that causes it to drop back down again.
Yeah, and Richard, on that point, sort of moving onto safety cases, what role would you say there is for simulation to provide robust evidence for safety cases, and what are the main challenges that do you think need to be overcome on that?
Yeah, so Tom made some really good points within that presentation. I was also in the interoperable simulation discussion earlier, and there were some really interesting discussion points on that panel. So I might end up paraphrasing a few of the previous comments, because I very much agree with a lot of what has been said. So simulation is very extensively used for product development, and it's how we get from I suppose that you're proving that a system is capable of performing this manoeuvre in this location, and it's how we get from that to understanding whether the system's capable of getting it wrong. So we're not testing to see whether it's capable of getting it right, we're testing to see whether it's capable of getting it wrong, which is a very different level of burden of proof. And simulation is going to be important in that, because we need to be able to sort of fuzz the system with a wide range of different parameters. So within the same scenario, what happens if the white lines are a bit degraded? What happens if you've got heavy rain? What happens if it snows? What happens if a person on an e-scooter appears just at this moment? And then you can play around with all those parameters, the speed of that e-scooter, the position of the e-scooter, the clothing that the person's wearing. And I think that's the key, really, because simulation allows you to get that exposure that you would never be able to accumulate with real-world driving. So it allows you to get that sort of coverage of the different scenarios. So, okay, you'll never get perfect coverage. You're always going to have to trust that the system's going to be able to sort of interpolate to some point between between the samples that you've taken, but it allows you to get much more coverage. Now, their challenge is how you actually trust that as a sort of robust piece of evidence to include within a safety case. And the key to that really is how you validate it against real-world data. So whether that's actually actively setting up a scenario on a proving ground or such, like with robotic actors, to give you, so if you've got an interesting scenario in simulation, recreate it in the real world in order to check that everything happened exactly like the simulator thought, or whether it's the other way around. You experience an interesting scenario in the real world, so you take that across into simulation. But then by comparing the two, by having those paired test cases, it allows you to then understand how similar is the correlation between the real world and the simulation, to look at all those different parameters within it. And that's not just in terms of what the vehicle does. You can also look inside the box and get much richer data if you're understanding what the perception layer of the system is seeing. So, for example, if the system has passed a pedestrian on the pavement there, it might pass them perfectly safely, but if it hasn't recognised the pedestrian, you know you've got a problem. So by breaking into the system and understanding what's happening within the box, you can get far richer data if you can understand what the system's actually seeing. And that's going to be the key. So to get those paired test cases, so you've got a sort of direct comparison between the real world and the virtual. And then once you've got that sort of validated test case in the virtual world, you can then start to expand out around it to sort of build a wider range of parameters, so you can start to extrapolate out from those test points. Now, the real problem with that, to answer, I think that was the second part of the question, what sort of challenges there would be. The problem with that is how far can you extrapolate? So you've got your correlated test case. How far out can you extrapolate before you get to the point where you have to come up with another correlated test case, which you then come out from? And that's something that's very difficult to answer in a sort of analytical manner. There's no sort of objective numerical way to come up with that answer. And I think to some extent we'll have to understand that through practical experience within industry, find out, sort of try it out for real, understand where the gaps are coming in, where the problems are emerging later on that we then identify. So we'll have to sort of come up with some sort of a political line on it and draw a line in the sand, what's acceptable. And I think it'd be a case of individual safety case argumentation for that. So I think that's the challenge. So we know we need to correlate between the virtual world and the real world. The question is how much correlation is enough, and then how much you can expand beyond those. And those are questions, I think, for a lot more research to be done upon before we can definitely...
Of course, like once you have been able to do that, if you can, how that kind of translates back into the safety cases, if you remember what Richard put up with the sliding scale, we can start to you almost use that as part of your evidence base, so you can think less about your mitigation and think more about, we're confident in our system to be able to deal with whatever scenarios that you want to be doing. So, hopefully it can be kind of fed back in to provide that additional kind of confidence for the safety case.
Okay. And quite a broad question, final one before we open up the audience. So as we hit the transition from trials into deployment, what can we do to make this as seamless and as safe as possible? I'd like Camilla to take the lead on that answer.
Okay, so we are in trials and testing at the moment, and I think over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, things have been increasing in complexity. And we're now starting to see trials where the safety driver is being taken out of the vehicle, and we're needing to look at this as a system as a whole rather than just operational safety that is controlled by a safety driver. And we've got standards. We've got the Zenzic safety case framework that Richard was talking about. We've got a whole suite of PAS standards. And then we've got this sort of processes are being developed for approval by DFT. And I think what's absolutely key is that there's no surprises. So we don't have, well, this is what you do during trials and testing, and this is what you need to do in order to have deployment. That actually the standards reflect good practice. So the suite of PAS standards reflect the good practice and the emerging good practice. That we update them in line with sort of advancing technology, our new learning, our new understanding, and that actually all of that aligns with the sort of developing CAV approval process. And at the moment we're updating PAS 1881, and what we're trying to make sure is that we're communicating with the technical authors of the CAV approval process, so we're feeding that into the standards, so that actually during trials and testing it's being implemented now. So it's a much smoother transition rather than saying this is what you do now, this is what you do in the future. So I think that's kind of helpful.
I think it's also extremely important that whatever we're doing in terms of the assessment of the vehicles, that the vehicle manufacturers have got prior knowledge of that. One of the most important sort of documents that Euro NCAP produces is our roadmap, and we're just updating that for 2030, and that'll be published later this year. And it sort of sets the manufacturers on notice as to what they'll need to do to get that coveted 5-star rating. And it's very, very important that the sort of requirements are very, very transparent for them and how we're going to assess them, because ultimately they'll want to replicate that to get good ratings. And we'll want to do that, but also learn from that to get the feedback. So all the things that we're doing within these various Zenzic projects feed into that. So we've got the best knowledge we can, and we're able to tell the vehicle manufacturers internationally, this is what you need to get these ratings, because we've already committed to put automated driving ratings into that 2030 roadmap.
Yeah, I'd certainly vouch for that, having been on the other side of the fence as at one of the OEMs and sort of having to monitor very closely the NCAP roadmap and understand what's coming up in the pipeline. Obviously, with the development life cycles involved, it's very important OEMs are in the loop on that, because they need to understand what they're going to be assessed against. And exactly like both Matthew and Camilla said, that feedback loop is going to be really important within it. So as we start deploying these systems and understanding what the commercial use cases are going to be and what the actual business case is going to be, we'll get a better understanding then of what hazards these systems are exposed to. And then you've got a feedback loop that feeds back into both the system safety case and the operational safety case. So it's an ongoing cycle, an ongoing feedback loop by which the manufacturers, developers, etc. will learn, the regulators will learn, and we can progressively sort of get more sophisticated in the way we approve these things and the way these things operate through that experience.
Sure, thanks very much. So, I think we've got about just under 10 minutes to open up to the audience. So, please put your hand up, and if Millie's ready, she will run to you with the microphone. We have one at the front. We can get the microphone there. Oh. No.
Keen to sell many car maker licenses so we can do more simulation, of course. How do we get the consumers to start pulling more and more robustness in the edge cases? So obviously an NCAP test, AEB, the perfect conditions, sunlight, no rain, straight line conditions, all those things is all well and good. But how do we get consumers to start to be more aware and want better performance in edge cases?
Well, I suppose the first thing is we recognise the limitations of what we do at the moment with Euro NCAP, and one of the pushes for that roadmap that I mentioned is robustness. We've already started to, make the situations more complicated and more replicating real-world crash scenarios. There is a limit to what we can do, as Tom was saying. As soon as it comes to, rain and fog and snow, it's randomised whether we can do that on a particular day, and we need to add that in. So that's the point at which simulation really plays, I think, an important role. We still don't know how to do that simulation of adverse weather conditions, but I certainly think it plays an important role. But also then the expansion of the ODD and the use cases. And there's a point at which, as was mentioned this morning, some of the scenarios that we undertake are inherently unsafe, or they're at least liable to damage the test equipment when we're doing head-on scenarios. So there's a role for that simulation in that as well. For getting the consumers to buy into simulation, that is something that we've been trying to address. And we, as Tom was explaining in that previous, his presentation, we still feel the need to do that validation process. We still feel the need to go from the 1,000 to the 10, because we still need to have the consumer with us, but educating the consumer to say these vehicles have been tested in a virtual way. And we do that to some degree at the moment with pedestrian testing. We are beginning to get the consumer to buy into the trust that we know what we're doing and we can assess these vehicles. And it is a blend between physical testing and virtual testing, and that will translate over time.
I think in-use safety monitoring will have a part to play in that as well, in the sort of generation of scenarios and edge cases where we've got this equipment, sensors, cameras, all this data being gathered on vehicles. We can use that to our advantage, take a much more sort of proactive approach to understanding when a collision could occur, feeding that into the scenarios we're using to validate the ADS, and actually get in there and prevent collisions from happening, rather than having this sort of continual sort of reactive approach, waiting for something to happen and then managing it. You know, we've got a huge opportunity here, you know, with in-use safety monitoring to generate those edge cases, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree with both of those points. I think that the key to a lot of this is how we sort of define the trial in the first place with the operational design domain. In a way, that the deployment domain is possibly more important in this than the design domain. Obviously, the deployment domain and design domain might not be exactly the same thing. But understanding what the parameters are that the system can operate within, whether that's the sort of defined routes or defined geofenced area that it operates within, or whether it's able to operate like an ALKS system on a road type, understanding what those parameters are, what the extremes are, including foreseeable misuse cases. You know, it's not just about your sort of centre of the bell curve, it's about what's happening at the fringes. And that study, and exactly like Camilla says, picking up that real-world data, whether we're collecting real-world data before the deployment or after the deployment, and I would suggest we want to do both. That's going to be the important thing, to understand what functions the system has to do and what environments the system has to do it within. And then if you've got that sort of problem space that you've defined by those, then you can explore the full range of there, and then you sort of look into your sort of sampling methods, your sort of ways to explore that search space. And that,
sure, sorry, just conscious of time. I'd like to, we've got about 4 minutes left, so I'd like to ask another audience question. I've got a chap in the fourth row there, if we can get that across.
Hi, yeah, Gareth from Scient. I was struck by Richard's photo of the experience that or the vision that we might all have for the future, and I was struck by the fact that it was a man of a certain age in a suit speaking to his wife, doting wife, you know, with the kid cooking at home, and it struck me that was quite a traditional image of the 1950s. So do we think we're doing enough around diversity and including diversity and I mean diversity of all types, you know, of all experiences, in both the safety and the usage of CAM? And I think, Camilla, you mentioned about the levelling up and how this experience may not be privileged people in a room like this with suits and, you know, our experience of Teslas and very expensive cars. So do you think we're doing enough to include the diversity question in safety and how we see autonomy in sort of the user of the future? It's
a very broad question. I'd like maybe Bhavin, if you'd be willing to give a very brief overview of that.
I think Richard probably wanted to defend his first.
I'm just conscious you've not spoken too much, but Richard, if you'd like to take it.
Yes, I suppose there are two elements to this. So one is the detection capability. So you've got to make sure that the vehicle is suitably sort of able to identify all sorts of different demographics of people. So, for example, if you had a system that was incapable of recognising anyone who was, I don't know, wearing a hijab or some other form of religious dress, obviously that would be completely unacceptable. So you've got to make sure your training sets that you're training any artificial intelligence neural networks with, you've got to make sure that that's suitably diverse to ensure that you're not disproportionately affecting one user group or other group of road users. So you could have a situation where you've shown that you've reduced the level of risk overall, but one particular group is disproportionately affected, and that's something that we've got to make sure we're not doing in terms of the training data. The other sort of aspect of the question is the sort of accessibility of the sort of new modes of transport. I'm not entirely sure how to answer that one at the moment, because I think that's something that will become clearer as we sort of get closer to roll out on a sort of commercial level and we start to see the business cases emerge. So yes, I completely agree. There is a risk that some demographics could find themselves less supported by this new mode of transport than others, and that's something we've got to work on an ongoing basis as the sort of commercial models emerge and people start putting forward business cases, etc.
I think if we move it back to what was discussed this morning by Mark and Claire, you know, there's a recognition that this technology should help people when it comes to accessibility, but that comes in many forms. And in my introductions, I call it transformation technologies. I truly believe that. You know, we should be aiming to make the world a better place. That's more equitable, safer and increase access for transport. So these solutions shouldn't be solutions that just replace your private transport with a automated pod. I don't think that's an outcome that we think is great for society. So we should be focusing on solutions that improve society and not kind of leave us in a status quo.
It's probably worth noting as well that CCAV have just commissioned research to look at different areas of the UK and actually specifically trying to reach the groups of people who haven't been reached at this point. So looking not only at urban but at rural areas, particularly women, children, ethnic groups, mobility issues, certain pockets of the UK that haven't been reached before. So I think that feels like a really positive step towards moving towards a much more sort of diverse solution that meets the needs of the ultimate end user.
Fantastic. Well, unfortunately, we are now out of time. Obviously, this conversation could just keep going and going and going. So I encourage you all to interact with the panel and each other, continue these discussions, and that's why we're all here. So, I'd like to thank our panelists for being with us today and sharing their knowledge on these topics. And thank you as well for the audience for your questions. And it's just a shame we didn't have more time. But as I say, let's continue the discussions in the breakout sessions. So. Thank you very much.